Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot, here at a special year-end Potomac Watch edition with my colleagues Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. And so my big third story is the Supreme Court, specifically its ruling in the two fair admissions cases against Harvard and the University of North Carolina against their policies of discriminating by race in admissions. These were landmark cases that clarified that the U.S. Constitution bars discrimination by race in all circumstances. The cases were about admissions, but Chief Justice John Roberts' opinion was sweeping and calls into question policies really across the society that use race to discriminate. Already we're seeing some lawsuits coming because of it against corporate policies that have ingrained diversity, equity, and inclusion policies into their hiring. And I think the good news here is that the Supreme Court decision pushed back hard against the trend that had been developing of racial balkanization in the United States. The ruling won't stop the desire for this across the board because identity is so much a big part of progressive politics these days. But it means that this faces new challenges in law, and I think the decision will have some cultural resonance as well. Kyle, you got one on the Supreme Court too.
Yeah, I will highlight the continuing attacks on the Supreme Court by Democrats, particularly in the Senate, and especially their ringleader, Sheldon Whitehouse. Let's listen to a clip of him talking about his legislation to put a new ethics code on the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court has at last acknowledged that it needs to have a code of ethics and has formally adopted one, which it kind of had all along. So the real test now is, how do you enforce it? Is there a place where you can file a complaint against a justice? Who sorts out the ridiculous complaints from the legitimate ones? For the legitimate ones, who does the fact-finding about what happened? Once you know what the facts are, who compares what was done to what is allowed under this new code of ethics? And do we get a public report at the end that explains? Really, really basic questions. They need to answer those. And until they do, that job is not done.
What has been driving this narrative is news reports, and particularly from the outlet ProPublica, on vacations that some of the justices had taken with friends, longtime friends in some cases, and in some cases a decade or two ago. And yet they have not been able to locate any sort of actual legal conflict of interest in these cases. And I should also add that the details of their criticism of the court seem to vary depending on whatever is most useful to them. Sometimes you hear Sheldon Whitehouse talk about how amicus briefs, friend of the court briefs, get filed by think tanks, and those think tanks have donors, and those donors also know the justices. It gets to be a little bit of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. And so he has offered this legislation that would allow the public to file complaints against Supreme Court justices that would be investigated by panels of lower judges. And there are real separation of power concerns with that. And I don't think that legislation is going to go anywhere. But it is notable that these attacks have been a year-long campaign. And then eventually, recently, the Supreme Court did issue on its own a code of ethics that, to my eye, looks like it is a restating of existing principles. And so maybe that will be useful in the future, but I do wonder about the decision to issue it because it looks like the court was acting under political pressure.
Well, and I would just say that, as Whitehouse suggested, he thinks he has the court on the run with the issuing of that ethics code. Now, maybe it will be a defense. I don't think so, though. If the Democrats get the majority in the Senate, keep the White House, and a majority in the House, and they have enough of a majority in the Senate to break the filibuster, I think they will, and they will impose the ethics code, which will essentially be a cudgel with which to harass and stigmatize and perhaps give excuse for packing the Supreme Court or perhaps ousting some justice because the White House said, well, who's going to separate the ridiculous charges from the legitimate ones. Well, I'll tell you, it'll be Sheldon Whitehouse or some of his agents, and it won't be a very pleasant experience. And it would be bad for the country, separation of powers, and for the legitimacy and the credibility of the courts. Kim, you've got something else, too.
Yep, I'm going to walk over to the other chamber of Congress, the House, and my story of the year is the epic House Republican speakers fight, and then with it, the rise and fall of Kevin McCarthy. Obviously, this story kicked off with the 2022 midterms when the House Republicans retook the House, although with one of the slimmest majorities ever. This was highlighted when we went through 4 days in January of a speaker drama in which it took 15 ballots to finally install Kevin McCarthy as speaker. Despite his longtime popularity in the party, there was a band of holdouts of conservatives. The price for ultimately giving him the speakership were these enormous concessions having to do with the way the chamber was operated, the rules, but in particular, the motion to vacate the chair, which is something that in the past a majority of a party had to use to get rid of a speaker. The new rules allowed just one person to pull the pin. And that came in October when Matt Gaetz, Florida Republican, seeming to have a bit of a grudge match with Mr. McCarthy, moved to get rid of him. 8 Republicans ultimately threw him out. We then went through 3 weeks of chaos, failed votes for Steve Scalise as speaker, Jim Jordan as speaker, an interim speaker, Patrick McHenry. Finally, Mike Johnson, a man hardly anyone had heard of, a Louisiana Republican, is now the new Speaker of the House. And, I recount this drama mostly because I think it says something unfortunate about the GOP and the divisions in the caucus, their failure repeatedly to understand that only in unity do they get anything done. They did it briefly with the debt ceiling deal in the spring. But interestingly, hard feelings from that actually played into the later speaker drama. And I think this is a very bad sign for the signal it sent to the country about the GOP's inability to govern. And we'll see if they manage to improve on that at all under Mr. Johnson in the coming months when Congress reconvenes. But it was pretty much a bit of a lost year, I thought, Paul, for Republican leadership.
That is certainly true. And the current Republican Party has a faction that has a purge mentality, which is we're better off if you all leave. And so we can dominate. And what that means is that the marginal member, the ones in swing districts, are going to be the most vulnerable. And this is in contrast to, I think, the dynamic that prevailed when Democrats ran the House. They understood that you need those marginal members, and you have to be able to get a majority, especially when a closely divided country. And this purge mentality, I think, is going to complicate things, not just for this Congress, but it could complicate things even if Donald Trump or some other Republican wins the election in 2024 and attempt to govern. Last week, Donald Trump Jr. decided that he would go out and denounce even the prospect that Nikki Haley might be the vice presidential candidate on a Donald Trump ticket. Of course, there's no indication that Trump Sr. would offer it or that Nikki Haley would accept it. But this is the mentality, which is if you don't agree with us on the mega priorities, get out of town and vote for somebody else, I guess. And that's a good way to remain a minority party, Kim.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember this attitude back more than a decade ago when Ted Cruz first got into the Senate, and you had Rand Paul and some other firebrands, and their attitude was, well, we'd rather have a minority of us committed, principled conservatives than a majority. And guess what? That's what they got for a while. And it doesn't do much for getting anything done.
Well, that's right. With that, I want to thank Kim and Kyle. Also, thank all of you for listening, not just today, but throughout the year of 2023. We sure appreciate it. And we will be back every day on Potomac Watch with the new year, one that could set the terms of debate for United States' role in the world for many years to come. So we hope you'll be with us, and we look forward to covering the presidential race and the rest of politics and events in the world. Thanks for listening.